This deck has gone from almost tier 0 to a pitiful shell of its former self. You know, kind of like that Glasgow Yu-Gi-Oh fella, huh? Existential crisis aside, I thought this would be a great time to discuss the failures of one of the most popular decks of all time, and that is Nekroz. The reason why I wanted to do this video is that I think there's so many cool, interesting topics to discuss about why Nekroz just isn't good anymore, and I think it's not just as simple as power creep, which is generally the answer that we go to when discussing old decks. When you look at a legacy deck, like for example, gosh, Fire Fists, Glad Beasts, or whatever, these are all decks which are, I'm pretty sure, are currently at full power and are just not even worthy of being like a rogue deck by 2019 standards. I think in cases like those, it's, yeah, pretty much just a case of power creep. But I think there are not so obvious reasons about why Nekroz just isn't a good deck anymore, and I don't think it's because of power creep, nor do I even think it's so much to do with the ban list, although that obviously does help, the fact that they don't have maximum copies of Unicorn, they're missing Lavavo Chain and Jin. Those are very important cards, but I think inherently the engine is still very strong without those cards, and even back in its full power days, those were never the cards that the deck had to rely on in order to win. So what is it about Nekroz in 2019 that's preventing them from being a good deck? I believe that the answers are not so obvious, and it's something I'll be exploring in this video in about 3 parts. So first and foremost, I will be talking about the ban list and how certain cards like Unicorn being limited are a hindrance, but I don't think it is the absolute root cause. The second part is I will be talking about power creep, but not power creep in the sense that maybe Nekroz itself has been power creep, but maybe more so in another context that I think maybe people haven't really mentioned before. And finally, I'll be discussing the meta itself and what it is about the current format that specifically is hindering Nekroz from doing anything. So now that the structure of this argument has been laid out, I just want to quickly take some time here to say if you enjoy these types of videos and my content and stuff, hit the subscribe button. And maybe leave the video a like or dislike so I know how you felt about it. First of all, let's begin with the most obvious one, and that is the ban list, and that, yes, ban lists are a way in which decks can be prevented from doing well, of course. If you ban Dante, we're probably never gonna see a Burning Abyss top again for the rest of our lives. Actually, I don't know about that. You know, Burning Abyss is one of those decks like a fungus that just doesn't go away. I feel like someone, some way will find a way to make Burning Abyss top without Dante. But that's besides the point. Nekroz is currently missing 2 copies of Unicorn from its main engine as part of this ban list, and maybe a copy of Shirt as well, since I don't think the deck ever really played 3. And further than that, you could argue Lavavo Chain and Jin. These 2 latter cards I think are very important, but I don't think they were the absolute deciding factor whether or not Nekroz was a good deck or not. Even back in 2015, a lot of people cut Jin and therefore made Lavavo Chain not redundant, but not as impactful or as necessary as it needed to be. I want to talk about something called diminishing returns, which is what I think something like Shuret and Unicorn can fall under. Diminishing returns basically means that once you start adding in a certain accessory to your deck, it begins to become less and less impactful the more of a resource you put into it. So for example, if I put Upstart Goblin in my deck, it's probably fine at 1 copy, 2 copies, 3 copies, maybe even 4 copies, but if we keep adding more and more and more upstarts into our deck, eventually it comes to a point where, well, maybe we need some engine cards. So there is diminishing returns with the amount of consistency your upstart is going to be giving you your deck after a certain amount of copies played. 1 copy of Shirt is extremely important and basically the difference between this deck being playable or not, because right now the deck is playable, but it's not like amazing. And I think that's mostly to do with Shuret coming back more than anything. However, if we add 1 more copy of Shuret to the deck, I think the deck would be a little bit more better. It'd still be a bit more consistent. I think 2 is a good number for Shuret, but if we bump Shuret up to unlimited, that's when diminishing returns, I believe, starts kicking in. Doesn't matter how many more copies of Shuret we put in Nekroz, it doesn't just make the deck better. In fact, it probably hinders it quite a lot. Unicorn is kind of in that same scenario where I think that probably 2 would be an ideal number to maybe help the deck. 3 is obviously ideal, I think, but if we do get it semi-limited in the next ban list, I think that'll help the deck a lot. But I don't think it'll be the difference between topping or not. So overall for this first section, I think the ban list is something that is holding Nekroz back, and if they do get more copies of Unicorn, it will certainly help the deck a lot. But I don't know if it'll become an absolutely standard meta deck at that point, just with more copies of Unicorn. It might, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think that is the single glaring reason. So what other possible reasons are there for Nekroz not doing so well right now, if not for the ban list? Well, I think it's power creep. But I don't think it's power creep in the sense that Nekroz cards are less powerful. I think Nekroz cards are some of the most powerful cards ever printed, and probably to this day is still up there, probably in the top 5 best decks of all time. So why is it just not doing well right now? Since the inception of Nekroz, we have had so many different tech cards and side deck cards printed that almost all of them inherently seem to directly shit on Nekroz. D-Barrier, Strike, Ash Blossom, Ghost Spell, Call by the Grave, Infinite Impermanence. That's just 6 cards I can name off the top of my head right now that absolutely destroy Nekroz. Generic staple cards that people are main decking, that people are side decking, all of these different options that people are playing for other meta decks, Nekroz is now being caught in the crossfire in these meta deck tournaments just because of the fact that they're so powerful and impactful against Nekroz. I might decide to side Shared Ride for the Sky Striker matchup. It's a very powerful card in the Sky Striker matchup. It's almost turn ending. It's basically like Max C. And if I build my deck to beat Sky Striker at an event, I have indirectly countered Nekroz just by putting in that copy of Shared Ride. And that's just one example. Think of all the other staple cards that are running around in the meta that just really cripple Nekroz. Ghost Spell can stop Nekroz Cycle. A super impactful power play after your first play may have been stopped is the cycle. Call by the Grave on Exomer targeting Shuret can absolutely tear apart your ritual summon. One single effect negation like Infinite Impermanence can actually just outright end your turn. A clutch Ash Blossom is very important as well, as is Solemn Strike on an important effect. Another disadvantage is that all the meta players today probably used to play Nekroz as their main deck however many years ago. So not only are people super familiar with how the deck runs and where the important clutch points to use something like an Ash Blossom can be, you now have all these power crept tech cards that are like designed to beat Thunder Dragon or Sky Striker or Salmon Great that are indirectly hurting Nekroz. So all of these staple cards came out after Nekroz and are just indirectly shitting on your deck just by existing. And that's basically the crux of the second argument, is that, well, we have so many of these cards printed recently that some of them might not be relevant right now, but if ever D-Barrier becomes good, Ghost Spell, Call by the Grave, which are being played right now to an extent, if those cards are just main decked or ever come up in play, it's very hard to come back from those as a Nekroz player. My final point to bring up is the contradiction in deck building we have today. You see, diverse formats are really good for generally the most amount of players possible, I think, mostly casuals and just semi-competitive players alike. You can have fun for longer because of a wide variety of matchups available. You can swap between decks to try something new and fresh. But diversity is actually pretty frustrating for competitive players because there's way too much to deal with. Not having a uniform way to deck build is actually quite difficult and sometimes adds a bit of unnecessary variance for super competitive players. And right now we're in a format where we have diversity to an extent, but for a Nekroz player, it is really diverse to the point that your deck completely gets skewed depending on which matchup you're playing against. So what the hell did I actually just say? Well, if you're playing against Sky Striker, you probably maybe want to main deck things like Evenly Matched or Kaijus and Denkos, and you want to go second against this deck to trish them and blow out all of their resources. However, against Thunder Dragon, the last thing you want to do is go second and stare down a Colossus. Two very prominent meta decks currently just existing in the meta completely tear apart your deck building. Like, what are you supposed to do? Do I main deck for Striker? Do I main deck for Thunder Dragon? Do I just wing it and hope I get paired against one over the other and hope I win those dice rolls? It's really hard to decide what to do. If you're just going blind game one and you win the dice roll, what do? Do you Unicorn pass? Do you just opt to go second? Well, like all the cards in your deck that are made to go second, then you have to go first against Thunder Dragon. It's a very convoluted way to play the game. So I think deck building is just really super skewed right now because right now the meta is specifically countering Nekroz. Nekroz has two mechanics that are very incremental to how it's mechanically played. That is searching and that is resolving effects. Sky Striker is very good at shutting down effects with multiple Widow Anchors. Thunder Dragon simply just summons a boss monster and your deck falls apart. You have to like hard draw Kaleidoscope, Unicorn or Bryonac to even stand a chance. And on top of that, these are tackled in very different ways. Do you go second or do you go first? So the format itself is completely crippling Nekroz's ability to do anything. I mean, you could just go first with Nekroz and resolve Zaborg and auto-win versus basically every deck in the format, sure. But I mean, number one, you're not going to win every single dice roll, and number two, even if you do win every single dice roll, you're not guaranteed to draw Zaborg in every single hand. You're not even guaranteed to resolve the Zaborg in every single hand. So overall, I think those are the three main reasons why Nekroz is doing really badly right now, despite, I believe, inherently being a super powerful deck in a vacuum, even with the current ban list hits. So in summary, if you take anything away from this video, I think that the ban list is very important, but I don't believe it's the only reason why this deck isn't doing well. Power creep is a kind of reason, but I don't think Nekroz is particularly just weaker in 2019. I think the cards are very powerful. I think it's more so that the staple cards have become so much more powerful and directly counter Nekroz. And finally, the current meta itself just directly counters Nekroz with a mistake on legs that is indestructible and multiple ways to negate effects. Comment, like, and subscribe. Patreon, whyjustcity.com, promo code FarfaFi. Follow me on Twitch, and until next time, adios.
Keep spending most our lives living in